According to Albert Hitchman's uneven growth concept, a developing economy may promote expansion by making initial investments in sectors with significant backward and forward connections. Examples of how the state will implement the current Chinese financial strategy include its planned pullout from low-linkage businesses and its sustained participation in high-linkage industries. China is the top most rehabilitated country worldwide. It has around 1.4 billion inhabitants. One of the first civilizations to emerge in the world was China. For the last 2 millennia, China was one of the most critical economic nations globally from the 1st to the 19th centuries. It's one of the most significant economies regarding nominal GDP and GDP regarding purchase power parity. It's the second most prosperous country in the world overall. According to international agreements, the government owns nuclear weapons with the second highest defense expenditure globally. However, it's grown exponentially since its inception and has a giant standing army in terms of its military personnel. Let's find out about the development strategies of China. China produced 24 new female billionaires in 2020 and 85 female billionaires as of January 2021, accounting for 2/3 of all billionaires worldwide. As of 2020, China had 698 billionaires and 4.4 million millionaires, making it second in billionaires and millionaires. China has surpassed the US as the nation with the highest population of people who have a net personal wealth of at least $110,000, according to Credit Suisse's 2019 Global Wealth Report. According to the Huron Global Rich List 2020, China is home to 5 of the world's top 10 cities, more than any other nation. The top 10 first, third, fourth, and fifth cities are Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. Every country has its own development story, so the same is for China. China has a long history of expanding its economic growth through adapting different development policies and strategies. Let's go into the development story of China. How did the development start? China has had a centrally planned Soviet-style economy from its inception in 1949 to late 1978. However, after the death of Mao in 1976 and the ensuing end of the Cultural Revolution, the economic growth strategy changed. Deng Xiaoping and the new Chinese leadership began to reform the economy and move towards a more market-oriented mixed economy under one-party rule. They privatized farmland, abolished agricultural collectivization, and paid substantial new emphasis to international trade, which led to the creation of the Special Economic Zones, SEZs. The liquidation of ineffective state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, and the reform of ineffective SOEs resulted in significant job losses. Modern China, primarily seen as having a market economy based on private property ownership, is one of the best examples of state capitalism today. Private entrepreneurship has significantly increased, with about 30 million recorded private enterprises in 2008, especially in pillar industries like energy production and heavy industry, where the state still plays a significant role. China's private sector generated 60% of the nation's GDP in 2018, 80% of the labor force in metropolitan regions, and 90% of all new jobs. Development strategies after 2010. China's economic growth rate slowed due to domestic financial worries, reduced commodity export demand, and an unsteady global economy in early 2010. China's $12.2 trillion economy surpassed the GDP of Germany's, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy by 2017. China's GDP performed somewhat better than Germany's in 2007. According to an IMF forecast from 2018, China's nominal GDP would surpass that of the US by 2030. There was the expectation that by 2025, 600 million more Chinese would belong to the middle class. China recorded 2.3% GDP growth in the arena of coronavirus in 2020. Before moving into the depth of unbalanced growth strategies in China, there's a need to understand what unbalanced growth is. Hirschman claims that the only way to accomplish development is to unbalance the economy. It's made possible by investing either in social overhead capital, SOC, or indirectly profitable enterprises, DPA. Directly productive activities are appropriate for external economies created by social overhead capital. Unbalanced growth through excess SOC and DPA. Investment in DPA will arise from uneven SOC if the economy is unbalanced through SOC. If there were DPA investments first, there wouldn't be any SOC, which would cause many problems for private investors. It thus leads to the creation of SOC, which throws off the DPA of the economy. A developing economy may encourage economic advancement by making initial investments in industries with significant backward and forward connections, according to Albert Hirschman's uneven growth hypothesis. The anticipated exit from low-linkage firms and continued involvement in high-linkage industries are examples of how the state will put the country's current economic strategy into practice. The study reveals that province-specific policies for the state sector's withdrawal have minimum effect on China's economic growth, even though connectedness is a critical factor in this process. Unbalanced growth theory in the case of China's state-owned enterprises. According to most commentators, it's lopsided, and the fundamental imbalance is of a specific kind. China's comparatively rapid GDP growth, especially during the past 10 years, is uneven because it depends too much on net exports and investment and too little on domestic consumer spending. The most glaring example of this mismatch is household consumption's declining share of GDP. 10 years ago, household spending accounted for about 45% of GDP. This figure is meager, yet not a record low. In East Asian countries that have adopted a growth strategy similar to China's, whose economies were consequently characterized by considerable savings and low consumption, the average household spends between 50 and 55% of GDP, and even in those countries, the average family spends between 60 and 70% of GDP. Another most effective development strategy that worked in the case of China's economic growth is big push industrialization. Do you want to know the story? Let's get into it. Big push industrialization in the Chinese economy. China spent 30 years pursuing its communist dream. This growth strategy is known as big push industrialization because it places a high value on investments in heavy industries. This development plan has affected practically every element of the Chinese economy. Even though the big push strategy and command economic system essentially covered Chinese pursuit of socialist development at this time, the framework's significance altered with time, and the legacy and selling policy changed in unpredictable and disruptive ways to the economy. There's a need to understand the big push theory to perceive China's economic growth strategies. Here it is. What is big push theory? The big push model emphasizes that a firm's decision to industrialize or not hinges on its expectations of what other businesses will do in development economies or welfare economies. Agriculture's percentage of the total GDP declined from 51% to 28% during the same period, while the industry's share climbed steadily from 18% to 44%. New initiatives were created, such as producing electric power generation equipment, chemical fertilizers, and automobiles. Most crucially, economic growth resumed after the Depression and war years' stagnation and upheaval. China's economy started to thrive in the 1950s, and it seemed like the big push approach was working. The new administration successfully secured the necessary financial and other resources to support a continuous investment program. There was a startup with some significant and successful Chinese versions of the big push command economy model and some disastrous and dump policies. When the PRC eventually changed the big push strategy and its growth plan after 1979, it discovered that the export markets and light manufacturing had untapped potential. China seized those squandered possibilities, frequently collaborating with firms from Taiwan or Hong Kong.